Did you look into, I don't know to what degree you looked into IBC, but did you look into maybe some elements also, like maybe you can share a little bit about the trust assumptions, how AWM works? And yeah, I don't know if you mentioned it earlier, maybe I missed that, if AWM could also be, if that's maybe also the goal to implement it outside of the Avalanche world.
Yeah, so Avalanche warp messaging is particularly optimized for high throughput point-to-point messaging. So IBC is arranged around this notion of like having communication channels between different zones. So like if you don't have a connection to some zone, you're not going to send a message there. So you have to form some connection and then keep that connection up to date with headers from both sides to make sure that you can validate the message if it's a bidirectional channel, right? Because you need to inform the recipient zone that like the validator set has changed, for example, on the source zone, right? Because then you wouldn't be able to actually validate the message correctly. So in Cosmos, like the zones are really serving as light clients of each other. Mm-hmm. And then when they're serving as light clients of each other, they can actually validate messages that come across that channel. Avalanche, because of the existence of this primary network, actually relies on that knowledge that everyone already has to validate messages. So there is no notion of creating a channel. When you send a message on warp messaging, you just sign it. Like the participants of the network produce like a BLS multi-signature, and then they can send it to any other subnet, maybe one they've never even communicated with before. And then that subnet can then take a look at that signature using the primary network, which already contains all the staking information, and say, okay, these are valid signatures from this set of validators, and that is X percentage of stake. And then the subnet can determine if that percentage of stake and subnet are, interesting to it and decide if it wants to process that message. So like an example would be, hey, like I created Patrick's subnet and I'm trying to steal all the USDC on some other subnet. So I'm going to like sign it with 100% of stake, but the subnet that I'm sending it to may say like, yeah, we're not going to grant you like a, 10 million USDC incoming transfer. So it's very similar in that to IBC in that the zones or the recipient zones make their own trust assumptions. Like they're the ones that actually say like this channel or the asset that comes over this channel makes any sense. So from that perspective, it has very similar ideas around trust, which is that every recipient of a cross-chain communication should alone determine if that's valid and what that means. But the actual overhead of that message is from the P chain and like this constantly evolving validator set there, rather than communicating over the channel information about the validator sets that is related. And then the last thing is just that AWM is just for sending bytes. It's a much lower level primitive than what IBC has, which has much more structured information and like fits very nicely into the Cosmos SDK to like route messages to certain components and everything like that. Warp messaging is very much just like, we're going to sign these bytes and then the recipient subnet can recognize these bytes, which allows us to make this like very EVM compatible messaging format that is very useful for contracts, but at the same time introduces complexity to have like multiple virtual machines communicate with each other, which was a huge goal for IBC, obviously, is to standardize that communication.
Yeah, and I also love to see IBC going out of Cosmos. There's actually a project on Avalanche called Landslide. I had a couple of calls with them. They're actually pretty cool. And what they're building is basically an Avalanche subnet that is also implementing IBC, right? So as far as I understand, it's built on the Cosmos SDK, or I don't exactly remember.
So I think that they forked some version of Tendermint or something like that allows it to like run on top of a subnet. Now, I think, sorry, I forgot your last part of your question, which is like, does it work outside of Avalanche? And like, how does that actually make sense with everything else? Avalanche warp messaging works really well within Avalanche. And that was the goal, the goal for it, right? Which is, we're going to produce some multi-signature and say that these validators signed it. If you're validating the P chain, you can verify that message's integrity like instantaneously, right? Because you have all that stored in memory ready to roll. If you're trying to send that same message outside of Avalanche, well, no one's going to understand what you're talking about, right? Like you're saying these node IDs signed this message. what does that mean to you? Nothing, probably, right? And so if you were going to actually take the messages in their existing format and bring it to other ecosystems, you would somehow then need to like synchronize the P-chain's activity to whoever's trying to like recognize those messages in their current form, which I think would be a lot of overhead to do. Because unlike in other ecosystems, on Avalanche, validators don't actually like sign the messages or like sign the blocks that are produced. So like Cosmos, for example, you have all the validator signatures in a block. So you can very easily attest and create like clients. But in Avalanche, there's no notion for that. And that's where we get a lot of the performance gains. It's not having to have like this one-to-many or like end-to-one communication to like share signatures with a single validator producing a block. So having to synchronize that, like the validator membership to other networks, I think would be the real step that would have to be done. And so you could do that if the P-chain started to produce like group signatures, like a BLS signature periodically that other ecosystems could then import. And that's something that we've talked about and something that would be really interesting, so that you could just take warp messages out of band and use them, you know, anywhere else. So subnet to many. But I think a lot of people have thought threshold signatures, particularly like TECDSA, is much more interesting for cross subnet communication, because you don't actually have to, or subnet to other network communication, because you don't actually have to track validator membership. You can just like produce a valid ECDSA signature, and then, you know, you could interact directly with Bitcoin, right? Like, are you going to get Bitcoin developers to conclude that they're going to like import P-chain message headers into like the core Bitcoin client? I don't think so, right? And so you kind of have to work with what you've got from the ecosystem, which for the most part is just validating certain well understood signature formats. So
is it possible that the primary network, I guess the P-chain in that case, could implement IBC? And if so, is that something that you guys are like, or have ever thought about? Because I had an interview with Emin around a year ago, and he was very passionate about interoperability in IBC. So I shilled him into that idea. I don't know whatever came out of it, but what are your thoughts?
I mean, it'd be really straightforward for a subnet to recognize IBC messages, because it's really easy for any network to serve as a light client of a Tendermint zone, I think. So like it would just listen to the messages just like any other zone would listen to the, you know, channel messages from somewhere else and then make sense of it. The complexity is really the other way, which is how do you get a zone to recognize the output of the messages from a subnet? Because the messages that it can produce only make sense within the Avalanche ecosystem, like the context of having the full validator set. So unless you somehow like communicate all those validator changes, like I mentioned, to the zone, it doesn't really make any sense. Like, I don't know how you would actually authenticate the IBC packet going out of the subnet. And so that to me is the complexity. Like a subnet could eat like messages coming into it, but it couldn't really produce valid things unless you added some sort of trust assumption to the zone that's reading those messages, which I think no one really wants to do. Nor do we, right? Like we don't want to have like some trusted channel producer that like aggregates what's happening on the P-chain and then sends that outbound. You really would want to have like some sort of P-chain certificate that then like Tendermint or Cosmos based zones could interpret and then determine if a message was valid. So that's my current understanding of the situation. And so I think the lack of bidirectional support or like the complexity around that has like tampered some of the excitement, right? Because it's like, great, like we can definitely take your stuff in, but if you can't like take whatever you brought in and bring it back, it's not really the, you know, solution that anyone, as far as I understand, is looking for.
Yeah.